"Don't speak unless I ask," Daniel Whitmore said without looking up, his voice low, controlled, and colder than the polished marble beneath Naomi Carter's worn black shoes, and the words landed softly yet heavily enough to quiet the subtle clinking of silverware around table 17 as Naomi paused with her notepad still in hand, her smile held gently in place as if it had learned long ago not to disappear even when unwelcome, while the restaurant's soft jazz continued to float beneath. Crystal chandeliers that reflected warm amber light across pressed white linens and tailored suits, yet at Daniel's table the air felt noticeably cooler, like a pocket of silence carved into the evening's warmth, and Naomi nodded once, professionally, stepping back as he returned to scrolling through his phone, his posture straight, expensive charcoal suit perfectly fitted, a stainless steel watch catching a brief glimmer of light as his fingers moved across the screen, while outside the floor to ceiling windows the city glowed in late evening calm, headlights sliding slowly along rain-damp streets as if the world itself moved quieter around him, and Naomi turned toward the service station, her shoes whispering softly against polished hardwood, her shift already stretching past 10 hours, her shoulders tight from balancing trays, her hands faintly dry from sanitizer and dish steam. Yet she carried herself with the same calm patience she offered every guest, because Naomi Carter had learned that dignity did not depend on who noticed it, and behind her another server leaned closer, lowering her voice. "That's Whitmore," she murmured, barely audible, and Naomi gave a small nod, because everyone in the restaurant knew the name Daniel Whitmore, the coldest self-made millionaire in the city, the man who built a software empire before 40, the man whose interviews were short and precise, the man who rarely smiled, and who, according to rumor, always requested table 17. Always sat alone, always ordered water first and decided later whether he would eat, though most nights the food returned untouched, and Naomi glanced back briefly, watching him for just a moment as he sat across from an empty chair, the second place setting untouched, a folded napkin resting perfectly aligned beside a polished fork, and something about the stillness at his table lingered with her longer than it should have, like a quiet note that refused to fade, while the kitchen bell chimed softly behind her, pulling her back into motion, her hands moving automatically as she carried drinks to another table, refilled coffee for a couple celebrating an anniversary, smiled at a tired nurse finishing a late shift, her voice gentle, steady, consistent, yet each time she passed table 17 she noticed the same thing. Daniel Whitmore barely moved, his glass of water untouched, condensation slowly forming along the sides before sliding downward in slow, silent trails, and the empty chair across from him remained perfectly still, as though waiting, as though remembering, and Naomi felt something quiet stir in her chest. Not curiosity exactly, not sympathy either, but something softer, something that recognized silence when it sat too heavily, and when she returned again, the restaurant now quieter as the dinner rush softened, she noticed his phone screen go dark as he finally leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting toward the empty chair for a fraction of a second before settling again on nothing in particular, and Naomi slowed just enough to notice the subtle tightening in his jaw, the controlled breath that followed. And she hesitated, just briefly, because she had seen that look before, not in millionaires, not in expensive suits, but in ordinary people carrying something unspoken, something heavy, and though his earlier words still echoed, "Don't speak unless I ask," Naomi found herself pausing beside the service station, her fingers lightly touching a small candle waiting to be replaced, its warm glow faint but steady. And the quiet of the restaurant seemed to deepen as she looked once more toward table 17, where Daniel Whitmore sat alone. Beneath warm chandelier light, surrounded by luxury, yet somehow wrapped in a silence that felt far colder than the evening outside. Naomi Carter replaced the small candle carefully, her fingers steady even as the warmth brushed softly against her skin, and she carried it across the quiet floor with the same measured calm she used for every step during the final stretch of her shift, the restaurant now easing into that slower hour when conversation softened and the clinking of glasses came farther apart, while the scent of roasted salmon and fresh bread lingered faintly in the air, and as she approached table 17 she paused just slightly, placing the candle at the center of the empty side of the table rather than directly in front of Daniel Whitmore, her movement subtle, almost invisible, the flame flickering gently as it settled, casting a warmer glow across the untouched napkin and polished silverware, and she stepped back without speaking, honoring his earlier words, though she sensed his attention shift before she even turned away, his eyes lifting briefly from the stillness in front of him, landing on the small flame that now reflected softly in the glass surface of the table, and For a moment he did not move, his expression unreadable, while Naomi quietly walked toward another table where a couple asked for coffee, her voice calm and kind as she poured steaming dark roast into thick ceramic mugs, her wrist steady despite the long hours that weighed gently on her shoulders, and behind her she felt the subtle change at table 17, not loud, not dramatic, but noticeable in the way Daniel leaned slightly forward, his hand resting near the candle as though measuring its presence, his watch catching the flicker of light as he studied it, and Naomi returned to the service station, checking receipts and organizing silverware, her thoughts drifting briefly to her own life beyond the restaurant, to the small apartment 12 minutes away, to the soft yellow lamp she always left on in the living room for her son, Marcus, who had fallen asleep earlier with his homework spread across the coffee table, and she imagined his quiet breathing, the faint hum of the old refrigerator, the comfort of ordinary things waiting for her when the shift ended, and the thought softened her expression just slightly as she wiped down the counter, while at table 17 Daniel Whitmore finally lifted the glass of water, though he did not drink, instead holding it loosely, his eyes once again drifting toward the empty chair, and Naomi noticed something in his posture now, a subtle shift, less rigid, though still controlled, and when she passed again, he did not stop her, did not speak, yet he did not look away either, his gaze resting briefly on the candle's flame before moving to Naomi herself, and she felt it, not as discomfort, but as quiet acknowledgement, and she slowed just enough to ask softly, keeping her voice gentle, "Would you like a few more minutes, sir?" And Daniel hesitated before answering, his voice quieter now, less sharp than before, "Yes," and Naomi nodded once, her smile small but warm, and as she stepped away, the candle's glow reflected softly in the window behind him, blending with the distant city lights, creating a layered reflection of warmth and solitude that seemed to settle around the table, and Daniel Whitmore remained still, his attention lingering on the small flame as though it had stirred something he had not expected, while Naomi Carter continued her quiet work, unaware that the simple act of placing that candle had already begun to shift the silence that had followed him for years. Daniel Whitmore finally reached for the menu but did not open it, his fingers resting along the edge as if the decision required more energy than he was willing to spend, and the candle's soft glow continued to flicker gently between him and the empty chair, casting a quiet warmth that contrasted with the cool city lights outside the glass, while the restaurant's late evening rhythm settled into a calm hum of low conversations and distant clinks of porcelain, and Naomi Carter moved steadily through her responsibilities, clearing plates, refilling water glasses, and offering small, reassuring smiles to guests finishing their meals, her movements practiced and unhurried, yet attentive to every subtle cue in the room, and when she passed table 17 again she noticed the menu still unopened, the water glass now half empty, and Daniel's gaze lingering not on his phone but on the small flame, as if it held something fragile and distant, and she paused just long enough to ask softly, "Would you like me to recommend something warm tonight, sir?" Her voice gentle and calm, and Daniel hesitated before answering, his expression tightening slightly as though the question had reached deeper than intended, and after a brief silence he said quietly, "No, thank you," yet his tone carried less distance than before, and Naomi nodded respectfully, stepping away without pressing further, because she understood that some silences needed time rather than conversation, and as she returned to the service station she noticed her coworker stacking glasses beside her, whispering softly, "He never orders much," and Naomi simply nodded, her attention drifting briefly toward Daniel again, noticing the way he adjusted the empty chair slightly, almost unconsciously, aligning it with the table, a small motion that suggested habit or memory, and the candlelight reflected faintly in his eyes as he leaned back, his posture still composed but no longer rigid, and Naomi continued her work, delivering a slice of apple pie to an older couple, her smile warm as she placed 2 forks beside the plate, and the older woman thanked her with a quiet kindness that lingered as Naomi walked away, while the restaurant's ambient lighting softened further, the overhead chandeliers dimming slightly as the evening edged toward closing hours, and at table 17 Daniel finally opened the menu, scanning it slowly, though his attention seemed divided, his eyes occasionally drifting back to the empty seat, and Naomi noticed this again as she approached with a fresh pitcher of water, her movements careful and respectful, pouring slowly into his glass, the sound of water gentle and steady, and for a brief moment Daniel looked up, meeting her eyes directly for the first time, and Naomi offered a small, reassuring smile, not intrusive, just present, and Daniel gave a slight nod in return, almost imperceptible, but enough to mark the quiet shift between them, and as Naomi moved away once more, the candle flickered softly, its warm glow reflecting across the polished table, while Daniel Whitmore sat in thoughtful silence, his attention no longer consumed by the cold distance he carried earlier, but drawn instead toward the quiet presence that Naomi Carter seemed to bring into the room without saying a word. The menu rested open in front of Daniel Whitmore, yet he had not turned a single page, his eyes drifting instead toward the candle's quiet glow, and Naomi Carter noticed this as she passed once more, the restaurant now settling into its final hour, chairs beginning to empty and conversations softening into murmurs, while the faint hum of an espresso machine echoed from behind the counter, and Naomi slowed her steps, sensing the quiet hesitation at table 17, before gently stepping forward. Her voice calm and warm. "Our chef just finished a fresh batch of tomato basil soup, sir. It is one of the warmer options tonight," and Daniel looked up again, his expression thoughtful rather than distant, his gaze briefly shifting from Naomi to the empty chair and then back to her, and after a moment he nodded slightly. "That sounds fine," and Naomi gave a small, appreciative smile, writing the order carefully, her handwriting neat and steady, before stepping toward the kitchen, her movements smooth despite the fatigue that pressed gently against her shoulders, and while she waited for the soup, she folded a clean napkin and placed it neatly over her arm, her mind briefly returning to her son at home, imagining him curled beneath a soft blanket, the quiet of their apartment, and the familiar comfort of routine. And when the soup arrived she carried it carefully across the dining room, the porcelain bowl releasing gentle curls of steam that warmed the air around her hands, and she placed it softly in front of Daniel, aligning the spoon precisely, her movements quiet and respectful, and Daniel looked at the bowl for a moment as though surprised by the warmth rising from it, then lifted the spoon slowly, tasting a small portion, and something subtle shifted in his expression, not dramatic, but noticeable, the tension in his jaw easing slightly. And Naomi remained nearby just long enough to ensure everything was satisfactory, her voice soft, "Please let me know if you need anything else," and Daniel gave a slight nod, his attention returning to the soup, and Naomi stepped away, continuing her final rounds, clearing empty tables and refilling water glasses, while the candle's light flickered gently beside Daniel's meal, reflecting in the steam that drifted upward, and he ate slowly, deliberately, as though rediscovering the simple comfort of warmth, and after several minutes he placed the spoon down briefly, his gaze returning once more to the empty chair, the candlelight casting soft shadows across the untouched setting, and Naomi noticed this again as she approached to refill his water, her movements calm and quiet, and as she poured she spoke softly, almost instinctively, "It is a quiet night tonight," and Daniel responded after a brief pause, "Yes, it is," his voice lower, less guarded, and Naomi gave a small nod, her expression understanding without pressing further, and as she turned to leave, Daniel glanced once more at the candle, then at Naomi, as though weighing something unspoken, while the restaurant's lights dimmed slightly again, signaling the approach of closing time, and Naomi continued her gentle rhythm of service, unaware that the quiet warmth she had brought to table 17 was slowly unraveling the silence Daniel Whitmore had carried for far longer than anyone in the room could see. Daniel Whitmore finished half the bowl before setting the spoon down again, his movement slower now, more deliberate, as though he was listening to something quieter than the restaurant around him, and Naomi Carter noticed the change as she gathered the last few plates from a nearby table, the dining room now nearly empty, chairs pushed in neatly, the faint scent of brewed coffee lingering in the air, while soft instrumental music played low enough to feel more like a memory than a sound, and as she passed table 17 again she saw Daniel's eyes resting on the empty chair, the candle flickering gently between them, and for a moment she hesitated, sensing something unspoken pressing against the silence, before she stepped forward to remove the soup bowl, her movements careful and respectful, and as she lifted the bowl Daniel spoke quietly, "You placed the candle there earlier," his voice calm but thoughtful, and Naomi paused slightly, nodding once, "Yes, sir," and Daniel glanced at the empty seat again before asking, "Why?" and Naomi felt the weight of the question, not as confrontation, but as curiosity, and she answered softly, "Sometimes a little light makes an empty space feel less lonely," her voice gentle and sincere, and Daniel remained still, the words settling into the quiet space between them, and Naomi carefully set the empty bowl onto her tray, preparing to step away, but Daniel spoke again, his tone quieter than before, "Do you always notice things like that?" and Naomi gave a small, thoughtful smile, "Only when it feels important," and she stepped back, allowing the silence to return, while Daniel leaned slightly forward, his fingers resting near the candle as though the warmth drew him closer, and Naomi moved toward the service station, her heart calm, unaware that her simple words had reached deeper than she intended, and the restaurant manager began dimming the lights further, signaling the final minutes before closing, while outside the city lights shimmered softly against the glass, and Daniel sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the empty chair, the candlelight reflecting faintly in his eyes, and after a moment he reached toward the second napkin, adjusting it gently, his movements careful, almost instinctive, as though preserving something unseen. And Naomi noticed this from across the room, her hands folding clean linens while she observed the subtle shift in his posture, less guarded, more present, and as she approached once more to offer dessert menus, Daniel shook his head softly, "No dessert tonight," and Naomi nodded respectfully, preparing to bring the check, but before she turned away Daniel spoke again, "Do you work every night?" And Naomi answered quietly, "Most evenings, yes, sir," and Daniel nodded once, his expression thoughtful, and Naomi stepped away to prepare the bill. The candle still glowing gently beside him, while the quiet warmth that had begun as a small gesture now lingered in the air between them, soft and steady, like a light that refused to fade even as the restaurant moved toward closing. Naomi Carter returned with the bill folded neatly inside a black leather holder, her movements calm and unhurried as she placed it gently on the edge of the table, careful not to disturb the small candle still glowing beside the empty chair, and Daniel Whitmore glanced at it but did not immediately reach for it, his attention lingering instead on the soft flame that flickered quietly between him and the untouched setting, while the restaurant lights dimmed further, the last few guests preparing to leave, chairs sliding softly against the floor, and the faint sound of dishes being organized echoed gently from the kitchen, and Naomi stood nearby for a moment, her hands lightly folded, offering the same quiet presence she had carried throughout the evening, and Daniel finally spoke, his voice low, thoughtful, "You said a little light makes an empty space feel less lonely," and Naomi nodded gently, "Yes, sir," and Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly toward the empty chair. "Someone used to sit there," he said quietly, the word simple but heavy, and Naomi remained still, her expression soft, understanding without intruding, and Daniel continued after a pause, "She liked this place, always said the soup tasted like home," and his eyes rested briefly on the spot where the bowl had been, as though the warmth still lingered there, and Naomi listened quietly, sensing the delicate weight of the moment, and after a second she spoke softly, "It is good to keep a place for memories," her voice gentle, steady, and Daniel nodded faintly, his fingers resting along the edge of the table, the candlelight reflecting softly in his watch, and the silence that followed felt different now, less distant, more human, and Naomi stepped back slightly, allowing him space, while the restaurant manager turned off another row of lights, leaving the room bathed in a warmer, softer glow, and Daniel reached into his jacket, removing a card and placing it inside the bill holder, but he did not close it right away, instead looking once more at the empty chair, then at Naomi, who stood quietly nearby, and for a brief moment his expression softened, not dramatically, but enough to show something shifting beneath the composed exterior he had carried earlier, and Naomi gave a small, reassuring smile, and Daniel finally closed the holder, sliding it gently toward the edge of the table, and Naomi picked it up with a quiet nod, her movements careful, while the candle's light flickered once more, reflecting softly in the glass window behind them, and Daniel remained seated for another moment, his gaze lingering on the small flame, as though reluctant to leave the warmth that had slowly filled the space, and Naomi walked toward the register, processing the payment with steady hands, unaware of the subtle change that had already begun, and when she returned, she placed the receipt gently on the table, the candle still glowing softly, and Daniel Whitmore sat quietly, his eyes resting not on the city lights outside, but on the small circle of warmth Naomi Carter had created, a quiet reminder that even the coldest silence could soften when someone chose to bring light into an empty space. Daniel Whitmore remained seated even after Naomi Carter placed the receipt gently on the table, the restaurant now nearly silent except for the distant hum of refrigeration and the soft shuffle of staff preparing for closing, and the candle still burned quietly between him and the empty chair, its small flame steady despite the faint movement of air from the vents above, while Naomi moved toward the last table near the window, wiping it slowly with a folded cloth, her movements calm and measured, and Daniel watched her for a moment, noticing the way she worked without rush, as though every motion carried intention, and after a few seconds he reached forward, carefully lifting the candle from the table, his fingers hovering near the warmth before he stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, and Naomi noticed the movement, her eyes lifting gently as Daniel stepped toward her, the soft glow of the candle lighting his expression in a way that felt unfamiliar, less guarded, more present. And when he stopped beside her, he spoke quietly, "You forgot this," holding the candle slightly forward, and Naomi smiled softly, "We usually collect them after guests leave," and Daniel nodded, but did not immediately hand it over, instead glancing once more toward table 17, now empty except for the second place setting still untouched, and after a brief silence he said, "She used to ask for a candle every time, even when the lights were bright," his voice calm, but carrying a quiet weight, and Naomi listened gently, her expression warm and respectful, and Daniel continued, "She said it made the table feel alive," and Naomi gave a small nod. "That sounds like someone who valued small things," and Daniel exhaled softly, almost a quiet breath of agreement, before finally placing the candle gently onto Naomi's tray, his movements careful, and as he turned toward the exit he paused briefly, looking back once more at the empty table, the city lights reflecting across the glass behind it, and Naomi watched quietly, sensing the shift in him that had unfolded slowly across the evening, and Daniel walked toward the door, his footsteps measured, while the host turned off another row of lights, leaving the dining room bathed in a soft amber glow, and just before he reached the exit, Daniel stopped again, turning slightly toward Naomi, who stood near the service station, and he said quietly, "Thank you," the word simple but sincere, and Naomi smiled gently, "You are welcome, sir," her voice calm, and Daniel nodded once, then stepped outside into the cool night air, the door closing softly behind him, and Naomi remained still. For a moment, her hands resting lightly on the tray, as she looked toward the now empty table, the faint warmth of the candle still lingering in the air, unaware that something within Daniel Whitmore had quietly shifted, like a door opening after years of silence, while outside, the city lights reflected across his windshield as he paused before getting into his car, glancing back once more at the restaurant windows glowing softly behind him, the warmth inside still visible from the street, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel Whitmore did not feel the same weight as he walked into the quiet night. The night air felt cooler as Daniel Whitmore sat inside his car, the dashboard glowing softly in front of him while the restaurant windows reflected warm amber light behind him, and he did not start the engine right away, his hands resting loosely on the steering wheel as he replayed the quiet moments of the evening, the candle's gentle flicker, the empty chair, Naomi Carter's calm voice, and the simple warmth that had filled a space he had grown used to keeping silent, and across the street a streetlight hummed faintly, casting a pale circle onto the pavement, while Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly as though releasing something he had been holding for years, and inside the restaurant Naomi stacked the last of the menus, her co-workers finishing their tasks with quiet efficiency, chairs aligned, lights dimmed further, and the manager thanked the staff before stepping toward the office, leaving the dining room wrapped in a calm stillness that followed the end of a long shift, and Naomi gathered the last tray, her movements gentle, before walking toward table 17 once more, her eyes resting briefly on the empty chair, and she adjusted the place setting carefully, straightening the napkin with the same care she had shown earlier, as though honoring a quiet memory she did not fully understand, and outside Daniel finally started the engine, the soft vibration filling the silence, yet he did not drive away immediately, instead glancing again toward the restaurant entrance, where Naomi's silhouette moved briefly behind the glass, her figure framed by warm interior lighting, and something about the quiet steadiness of her presence lingered with him, and after a moment Daniel reached toward the passenger seat, where the receipt rested folded neatly, and he opened it again, his eyes pausing on the handwritten note Naomi had added beneath the total, a simple line written in neat, careful letters, "Wishing you a warm evening," and Daniel read the words slowly, the simplicity of them settling gently into his thoughts, and he folded the receipt again, placing it carefully into his jacket pocket, as though preserving something small but meaningful, and inside the restaurant Naomi finished wiping the final table, turning off the small candle she had collected earlier, the flame fading quietly into a thin curl of smoke, and she placed it into the tray, her expression calm, unaware of how deeply that small gesture had reached someone outside those walls, and Daniel finally shifted the car into drive, pulling slowly away from the curb, the restaurant lights fading into the rearview mirror, yet the warmth of the evening remained with him, soft and steady, and as he drove through the quiet city streets, passing rows of dim storefronts and late night traffic lights blinking yellow, he found himself noticing small things he had ignored for years: the glow of a late-night diner, the quiet rhythm of a pedestrian crossing the street, the warmth of light spilling from apartment windows, and when he stopped at a red light he reached briefly toward his jacket pocket again, touching the folded receipt as though reassuring himself it was still there, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel Whitmore drove through the quiet night not with the familiar weight of silence, but with the gentle warmth of a simple moment that had begun to change something within him. The next evening arrived quietly, the city settling into its familiar rhythm as Naomi Carter tied her apron behind her back and stepped onto the restaurant floor, the soft glow of chandeliers reflecting across polished glass and white tablecloths, while the faint aroma of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen, and she moved with the same calm presence she carried every night, greeting early guests with gentle warmth, her footsteps light across the wooden floor, and as she arranged menus at table 17 she paused briefly, her fingers smoothing the napkin across the second-place setting, the empty chair still positioned neatly across from the main seat, and though she did not know why, she placed a small candle at the center of the table again, its unlit wick waiting quietly beneath the warm lighting, and moments later the front door opened softly, the cool evening air slipping briefly into the room. And Naomi glanced up as Daniel Whitmore stepped inside, his posture still composed, but his expression subtly different, less distant than the night before, and the host greeted him with quiet familiarity before guiding him toward table 17, and as Daniel approached, his eyes immediately noticed the candle resting at the center of the table, unlit but ready, and something softened in his expression as he took his seat, while Naomi stepped forward calmly, her voice gentle, "Good evening, sir," and Daniel nodded slightly, "Good evening," his tone quieter, warmer, and Naomi lit the candle carefully, the small flame rising gently between them, its glow reflecting softly across the table, and Daniel watched the flame for a moment before glancing toward the empty chair, his gaze thoughtful, and Naomi offered water, pouring slowly into his glass, her movement steady, and Daniel spoke after a brief pause, "The soup was good last night," and Naomi smiled softly, "I can bring it again if you would like," and Daniel nodded once, "Yes, please," and Naomi stepped toward the kitchen, her calm presence lingering as Daniel settled back into his chair, the candlelight flickering gently beside him, and when Naomi returned with the soup, steam curled softly upward, warming the space between them, and Daniel lifted the spoon slowly, tasting the warmth as his shoulders relaxed slightly, and after a few moments he reached into his jacket pocket, removing the folded receipt from the night before, placing it gently on the table beside the candle, and Naomi noticed it as she passed, her eyes briefly scanning the familiar handwriting she had left, and Daniel spoke quietly, "I kept this," and Naomi gave a small, surprised smile, "That is kind of you," and Daniel shook his head gently, "It helped," and the words rested softly in the air between them, and Naomi nodded, her expression warm and understanding, while the restaurant filled gradually with evening guests, yet table 17 remained wrapped in a quiet calm, the candle's glow steady, and after finishing the soup Daniel placed the spoon down carefully, glancing once more at the empty chair, then at Naomi, and for the first time he allowed a faint, genuine smile to appear, small but unmistakable, and Naomi returned the smile softly, and as the evening continued Daniel remained longer than usual, sipping warm tea Naomi recommended, while outside the city lights shimmered against the glass, and when it was finally time to leave, Daniel stood slowly, placing payment inside the holder, then paused briefly, his gaze resting on the candle once more, and he said quietly, "Thank you for the light," and Naomi nodded gently, "You are always welcome here," her voice calm and sincere, and Daniel stepped toward the door, the soft glow of the candle reflecting faintly in his eyes as he left, and Naomi extinguished the flame after he departed, the thin curl of smoke rising gently into the warm air, while the empty chair remained softly illuminated by the overhead light, and Naomi adjusted the napkin one final time before turning back toward the dining room, and outside, Daniel Whitmore paused beside his car, glancing once more at the restaurant windows glowing quietly behind him, and for the first time in years, the silence around him no longer felt empty, but gently filled with the warmth of a small flame, a quiet voice, and the simple kindness of someone who had reminded him that even the coldest evenings could still hold light.